and it is 2 minutes past 6. So I think, although people are still joining us, we should make a start on this inaugural Oxford World's Classic Shakespeare webinar. It's really brilliant to welcome all the attendees to the start of what seems exciting and quite a crazy prospect. This is the first of, at the moment, 41 webinars, monthly webinars, the first Monday of each month, except for the summer months, where we're going to work together through Shakespeare's canon of plays and poems, using the occasion of the New Oxford Shakespeare edition being published in these individual plays, individual volumes rather, as Oxford World Classics. So this webinar is jointly hosted by the English faculty at the University of Oxford and by Oxford University Press, who publish these books. And let me just tell you a bit about how we think this is all going to work. We've got 75 minutes scheduled for each webinar. They'll also be recorded, but there's no recording of anybody else other than the panelists. And that's in part because you won't be able to ask questions by raising your hand. Unfortunately, what we ask you to do if you want to ask a question is to use the Q&A function on Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screens if you haven't looked at that before. If you click on the Q&A, you have various fun options to look at what other people are asking and vote up their questions if you too are interested in them. And we'll try and take as many of those as we can before we finish this evening. My name is Emma Smith. I am the general editor for the Oxford World Classics Shakespeare, and that means I have had two extraordinary professional privileges. The first is to work with the New Oxford Shakespeare texts. This has been a huge project of editorial work published by Oxford University Press under the general editorship of Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boras, and Gabriel Egan. And without them, we couldn't have done this work that we are talking with you about in the series. And a particular call out to Francis X. Connor at Wichita University, who is the editor of As You Like It. His is the text that we are working with and sometimes arguing with, as we'll come to later in the conversation. So that's been one extraordinary privilege, and their work is absolutely at the heart of these editions. But the second thing has been the chance to pick people to introduce these plays and poems anew for the 21st century. And that's been an enormous treat for me. And I absolutely knew as soon as I began to commission these that I wanted Todd Borlik preferably to do As You Like It. And that's turned out to be the case. I had met Todd at a Shakespeare conference a few years ago, and I was so blown away by his insight, his kind of mile-a-minute speech, his extraordinary command of all kinds of different fields, but particularly his expertise in developing and interrogating the field of eco-criticism. And that's one of the things that we want to talk about alongside the play today. So it was brilliant to get Todd to write the introduction to this edition of As You Like It. And it's even better to have the chance to talk with him and with you and for you this evening. What's the evening for us? Todd's in Indianapolis in a snowstorm, I think. Is that right?
That's right. I've just dug out from about 8 inches of snow in the driveway. So yeah, the winter wind is in full effect here.
Oh, okay. So the environment is already pressing in as the conversation, as our conversation will explore. Brilliant. So we're going to start by thinking about the play in Shakespeare's career. We're going to try not to assume that you are already deeply familiar with it. There's a whole range of different people have joined us for all kinds of different reasons. So we're going to start perhaps a bit more general and then get more specific as we go. So Todd, tell us about how you see As You Like It fitting into Shakespeare's career.
Well, first off, Emma, again, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here and for the opportunity to write the intro for this play. It was a clear labor of love on my part. And although today being January 6th, it would seem more appropriate for us to be discussing Twelfth Night, uh, um, I'm happy to be talking about As You Like It
Yeah,
with
we have not
today.
published Twelfth Night yet, but we've got another three Twelfth Nights to go in the series, so it'll be fun.
maybe 2026
Yeah,
next from now.
2026
So
maybe.
everyone tune back in for that.
Mm.
Um, well, this is a play, as many of you will know, that is one of Shakespeare's most beloved comedies, and there's a reason for that. It encapsulates so many things that we love about Shakespeare: the cross-dress heroine, the Greenwood setting, the melancholy intellectual, the sardonic clown. It's really the whole package. It's play Shakespeare writes at the very end of the 16th century. It's kind of a fulcrum, right, for his career. It encapsulates all the achievements of his comedies from the 1590s, the early phase of his career, and it also foreshadows that streak of grandiose tragedies that he's going to write in the next decade. So it's a play that, in some ways, is one of perhaps the most definitive Shakespearean play.
Yeah, there's a great part in your introduction where you go through, the kinds of points of connection with plays from, I don't know, Winter's Tale to Hamlet, and put it in dialogue with all of those. There was one bit that really struck me. As you say, it comes at the 1599, doesn't it? It comes at the end of that comic period. But there's a lovely bit where you talk about it as a self-aware play, a play that sort of is riffing on its own genre. And I'm just going to read this bit out because I liked it so much. Like a postmodern rom-com, As You Like It invites us to smirk at its own formulaic conventions, thereby purging love of cliche while making it feel all the more genuine. And then this is a very Borlik sentence, I think. The head ridicules our irrational desires without diminishing their power to make the heart race. It's such a lovely sentence. I'm going to read it again. The head ridicules our irrational desires without diminishing their power to make the heart race, which is a lovely way of thinking of sort of putting the way we might feel and think about this play. But can you talk a bit more about As You Like It as a self-aware or almost even ironic play?
Yeah, definitely. So Shakespeare is adapting this story. That's the first thing readers should know. Like most of his plays, he's not coming at this with a fresh slate. He is adapting a very popular work by Thomas Lodge called Rosalind. And by doing so, he's already read it, he's already digested it, and he's read it critically. And two of the things Shakespeare does to tweak the story are introduce two characters. One is Jaques, the melancholy intellectual, and the other is Touchstone, the boisterous, cynical clown. And having those two guys there as kind of a peanuts gallery, right, who are riffing, commenting on the love story from the margins, right, from the sidelines, provides a kind of detachment. It allows Shakespeare to look at love with this more clinical eye, and to see it from these different perspectives. We have the elder shepherd's perspective too, Corin in the play. So Touchstone reflecting on him, his past love affairs as a young man. So it's a comedy full of this youthful energy, but it's written by a playwright who feels that he's already entered middle age. So there's that slight disconnect that introduces this element of detachment and intellect into a comedy that's nonetheless still very bursting with vivacity and the youthful energy. And I love that formula, that the complexity of it. It's a really thick broth that Shakespeare stirred up for us.
That's a great way to think about the well, yeah, there's loads to think about, just as you've said that. It's already making me think, oh, okay, that's one of the ways this is a sort of King Learish play in embryo. Because it's got these generations sort of yeah, that's maybe we'll park that for a moment, but it's a really great thought that you've sparked for me. Um, I was thinking about the way the play actually begins with questions of inheritance and the sense of the generations passing, I suppose. So it's not exactly a young person's play, like as perhaps we tend to assume comedies are, that comedies have cleared out the older generation and are really about young people. But this is more cross-generational, I suppose.
Yeah, it's in part because the love story of Orlando and Rosalind is not the only um, horse in the show, right? There's all these other characters that
Oh,
populate
the only
the play.
sheep in town, yeah.
Yeah. So it, Rosalind's really the dominant figure. I think the play by rights really should have been named after her, as it was in Lodge's original work. But the addition of all these other characters really complicates it. So it's not um, solely Rosalind's viewpoint. And I think what makes her so attractive as a character is that she seems to somehow absorb the ideas and the philosophies, the mentalities of the other characters. So she, in the same way that kind of Hamlet does in his play, she's a sort of a female equivalent of him in that respect. So she's the dominant figure, but her mentalities is expanded, becomes so capacious because of the conversations that she engages with, the debates that she has with all the other characters.
Yeah, and she's a really good example of that line of yours that I just read out about the difference between the head and the heart. Men have died and worms have eaten them. Very Hamlety. I can see where you're going there. Men have died and worms have eaten them, but not for love. But she says that within a sequence which is all about excessive, slightly fictive romantic love in a way. Is this a play that then is having it both ways, that it's sort of critiquing and indulging in these romantic comedy fantasies at the same time?
That's a great way to put it. I mean, that's like what I was trying to capture in that
Mm,
sense, that it has its cake and eats it too,
mm.
proverbially. So it's yeah, that's part of its charm. Rosalind, because she is able to see that she's behaving in a ridiculous manner, that um, that her infatuation with Orlando is completely irrational. Some man she's just met, and she's instantly smitten with him, and she knows that this is an absurd thing to do, to give her heart to this man she's seen once, but she finds it irresistible. So she mocks herself for doing it, but still indulges in that feeling as well because it's so overpowering.
Yeah, that's so striking. Do you think does Shakespeare make Orlando a worthy match for
Mm-hmm.
Rosalind? Do you think, or I feel as if I often read people who have a sort of slight sense of disappointment, maybe about Orlando, and
Yeah.
perhaps sometimes about other the sort of rom-com heroes are not as compelling, maybe
Yeah,
as the
depends on
heroine.
the casting, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much.
That
Yeah.
can really sway it either way. But I think your general insight there is absolutely right, Emma. That the men seem to be a little duller than the women, a little slower than the female leads in the comedies. And As You Like It is probably the ultimate example of that, because of Rosalind's wit. And Orlando seems a bit, doltish at times, right? It's not clear again how, at what point he becomes aware that that Ganymede is in fact Rosalind,
Mm,
and if she's able to sustain that charade for a longer time, then
mm.
from because of the dramatic irony, the audience is going to think of him as uh, somewhat imperceptive, shall we say, right?
That's such an interesting point about dramatic irony more generally, isn't it? That one of its, it's such a Shakespearean technique. We always talk about it. The audience knows more than the characters, basically. Um, that's quite that puts a distance between us and the characters. That doesn't it, and makes us think. Well, I wouldn't have been taken in by that. It's obvious to us all these double meanings, or the fact that the conversations is works out very differently if you really understand who this disguised figure is. That's a source of pleasure, but it's also perhaps a way of distancing us from the experience of Orlando. We're not taken in. We're very
Yeah,
rarely taken in, are we, by Shakespeare? Funny.
yeah, and Orlando is such a thoroughly literary figure too, right? So he's trailing all these uh, odors of poetry behind him, right? He's trailing all that baggage from the tradition of the Orlando figure from the Italian epics. There's a famous um, book, Orlando Innamorato, the Orlando in Love, and Orlando Furioso, these two great Italian epics. And he's writing a lot of really awful poetry about Rosalind, and then he doesn't even recognize the girl when she's right in front of him. So I think there's a lot of rich irony there that we're supposed to be somewhat skeptical, so look slightly askew at this romance. I mean, just as we do with Romeo and Juliet, right? We remember how young they are and how naive they are. And I think Shakespeare is, he's applying some of those same techniques in As You Like It. But we have a much more mature Juliet in Rosalind, and she has a kind of authorial consciousness, I think, that's closer to Shakespeare's, and that she kind of schools Orlando a little bit in abandoning some of his Petrarchan, his exalted ideals about women as these lofty goddesses.
Yeah, that's another cake and eat it, isn't it, moment that in a way this deeply pastorally informed, rather knowing play seems to be trying to suggest to a rather over literary young man that he needs, to get real. He needs to leave this fiction behind him and sort of think about the flesh and blood world. But the flesh and blood world that he's being inducted into is not really flesh and blood either. I mean, it's a sort of pastoral, strange sort of pastoral space. You talked about it as the play as a green world play. And the Forest of Arden clearly has been one of the most compelling of Shakespeare's settings, really, hasn't it? You start the introduction brilliantly with a game, a video game, a sort of Second Life, sort of alternative world, as I read it, called Arden, as a sense that this is almost a kind of virtual reality or an alternative reality as we would understand it now. How does Shakespeare use that location, do you think? What does it mean for your reading of the play?
Mm. It's laden, it's layered with all of these different meanings, isn't it? It's both a geographical place, but it's also a metaphysical locale as well. So there are many different ways to think of it. Those of you who read the New Oxford Shakespeare edition will see that we've spelled it Ardenne, which is evoking the forest on the Franco-Belgian border, which is perhaps most notorious today as a site of some of the worst fighting in World War I. But in Thomas Lodge's novella, it's in between Lyon and Bordeaux, so he has it further south. For Shakespeare and his audience, though, it's also irresistibly going to recall the forest in Warwickshire and Shakespeare's own figurative backyard. And as many will know, too, Arden is Shakespeare's mother's maiden name, so it has a real personal connection to him. It represents this pastoral dreamscape. And you're going back to the first line with Adam saying, with Orlando saying that, as I remember Adam, the play is trying to lure us back into this Edenic space. And Arden seems to be that vision of a primordial, unspoiled sylvan wilderness. But in fact, when you read the play carefully, as we weave into the trees and down the paths of Arden, we discover that in fact it's already a very civilized place with a large human footprint, and that a lot of the trees have been uprooted to make way for sheep pastures. So we think of Rosalind and Celia playing kind of Marie Antoinette and dressing up as shepherdesses as this kind of way of getting back to nature. But it's important to keep in mind that the wool industry is a major driving force behind deforestation and ecological havoc in early modern England. So Shakespeare, I think,
Now
does
that's interesting.
really
So
speak around that.
so sheep farming is a sort of intensive industry in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century. It's being it's located in former woodland. Is that right? So there's deforestation. Where's all this wool going? What are these sheep doing?
Oof. Well, a lot of it's being exported to
Right.
be carted and exported for the textile industry. Um, so, yeah, I mean,
But
England
that's
is
such an interesting economic uh, point, isn't it, about the Shakespearean period, as we would call it, coming from this direction, that the countryside is being massively changed uh, by this industrial scale farming for export. I mean that all feels very modern, doesn't it? That you're not producing things for a local market or anything. But you're really intervening in a way which makes that nature culture binary completely explode, doesn't it?
yeah,
So the forest is the Forest of Arden even a forest? It's a great thought.
yeah. More of the scenes seem to be set in pastures than they do in woodlands. So, stage productions which create this ersatz forest and they litter the stage with tree trunks are actually giving a slightly misleading impression of what the background of the play is, and that's really important. Uh, that because the Forest of Arden, if anyone, if you've traveled through Warwickshire and gone looking for it, it is hard to find. Right, there's not a lot of it left because it wasn't protected. It wasn't a official royal forest. And when you read the stage directions for the entrance of the Duke and his fellow exiles, they are identified as foresters, which in some ways I think of as Shakespeare providing the kind of forestry service to that Elizabethan England didn't have, that it lacked, that led to the eradication, the dwindling of a lot of England's woodlands throughout this period.
So it's also the case, isn't it, that a forest is a cultured or a cultivated
Hmm.
space. Is that right? That it needs management. Woodland needs management, but perhaps a less intensive form of intervention than the sheep farming.
Hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Emma. That they had foresters that patrolled the royal game preserves, right, to keep out poachers and to regulate the wood cutting. So they are, they're tree farms and they're hunting preserves.
Mhm.
And it's curious, if you read the first folio, Shakespeare follows all the Elizabethans in spelling forest with a double R in the middle. Forest, which the Elizabethan forester John Manwood suggested was an etymological uh, indication or clue that the purpose of forests was to provide a shelter, a refuge or rest of wild animals. So they're wild spaces, but they're also paradoxically heavily regulated. And again, that's something that's very modern about the play too. And it's view of the natural world. Nature and culture seem to be really conjoined in this play.
Does that make it? I mean, that already seems to make it a much more topical play, perhaps. Oh, great. I hadn't noticed your accessorized cup there. That's a professional kind of
Yes.
pro
That's from the British Library exhibition,
pro prop. Very good.
2016.
Um, I suppose, when we begin by saying, As You Like It, one of Shakespeare's most beloved plays, and we can, see a long, at least 19th and 20th century stage history for it, and so on. That makes it seem a timeless, um, kind of time in some sort of timeless world. But this already feels a more urgent and a more immediate moment. Could you talk a bit more about Shakespeare's relation to that kind of turmoil in the countryside? I mean, he's a country boy, isn't he, who's gone to live in a big city.
Yeah, absolutely, Emma. This is a play that's really near to Shakespeare's heart because of the Warwickshire connection. So it's, I think, very uh, easy to see this play as an allegory, an ecological allegory for developments in Shakespeare's home county. Now, I already talked about the sheep, which you get outnumbered people in the countryside by a ratio of 3 to 1, right? Because of the wool industry. And what happens is you have a lot of enclosure of land, right, of the commons to make sheep pasture. So land that was publicly accessible to the poor is being privatized. And that's upsetting a lot of people and driving a lot of migration to London, right? So you see the rural decline, rural depopulation, and urban overpopulation. That phenomenon is definitely well underway in the late 16th century. Shakespeare's contemporaries are aware of it. The other thing that's happening in this decade is we have the apex of the Little Ice Age. So some of the worst weather, some of the wettest summers in English history happening in the years 1594 to 1596. And this creates a lot of turmoil in Warwickshire. There's a lot of uprisings and unrest. And so Shakespeare is probably commenting on that in As You Like It. You see, even though the play imagines Arden, we often think of it as this sylvan paradise, this kind of Robin Hood like Sherwood. The Duke makes it quite clear that it's a difficult place to live. It's enthralled to the winter wind, right? They're bitten by the icy fang of the winter wind. That it's a place that opens in winter initially, and he stresses the bitterness of the cold, the winter chill, and I think that also reflects the meteorological turbulence of the Little Ice Age. So Shakespeare's contemporaries were also dealing with climate change, like we are. Maybe it wasn't human induced, but they were anxious about the state of the climate. And I think one of the things that the play seeks to do in moving from this wintry hard scrabble opening with the Duke and his men shivering out in the woods into the springtime, the only pretty ring time, is to kind of try to get the seasons back in cycle, to resynchronize them, because things seem to have gotten out of whack or out of joint, to use Hamlet's phrase.
This is going to seem a very naive question. I want us to look at that speech of the Duke's maybe in a minute. So I'll put that up on the screen, and then maybe you could talk us through some of the detail of that, which I hope might be interesting for the people in this webinar. But if I ask us a sort of a very sort of blunt and unsophisticated question, is Shakespeare on the right side of these questions? Is he on the right side of history? And I suppose I'm asking that because what do Rosalind and Celia do when they arrive in the Forest of Arden? I mean, they become sort of landlords or sheep. Do they buy the sheep? What? I mean, they seem to immediately take their place in this rural hierarchy, which, as you've pointed out, has a lot of negative consequences.
Yeah, as a Shakespearean, I'm sure you feel this way too, Emma. We prefer to see Shakespeare on the right side of history, and then you don't devote your career to studying someone just to bash them and tear them apart. Or at least I don't think that's that's a recipe for a healthy lifestyle or mindset. And I do sincerely, legitimately believe that Shakespeare had such a far-reaching intellect. He had such capacities for empathy and foresight that more often than not, he is on the right side of history. And while it's anachronistic to call him an environmentalist, I wouldn't go that far. I think he is thinking about environmental issues and raising them in ways that are really cutting, really provocative for his era. So Jaques' speech about the wounded stag is a great example of that, where we have a plea for animal rights and an understanding that humans need to walk gently on the earth rather than acting like ecological tyrants over it.
Mm. It's helpful. I agree with you about that sense that we are invested, aren't we, in a Shakespeare who is modern or
Mm.
and sometimes I think our hopes for that really exceed what is reasonable to expect of a person who lived and was sort of subject to the kinds of influences that Shakespeare as a real sort of person rather than a kind of fantasy person was. But I absolutely agree that we're sort of very invested in that. There's a slight. I was just thinking there's a slight niggle in that, isn't there? Isn't one of the Shakespeare biographical things we know about? I'm thinking about. Do you remember that play by Edward Bond
Mm.
called Bingo, which was about a very um, uh, uh, a very sort of negative, the opposite of that view that we were
Yeah.
just talking about of Shakespeare, very much turning on the issue of enclosure and this
Uh-huh.
sort of sheep economy that we've been talking
Yeah.
about in Shakespeare's own biography. Tell
Yeah,
us
well,
a bit
there's
about
always
that.
the artist and the man, as it were. And
Yeah. So
I think,
Shakespeare's on the wrong side of that, isn't he? Or we think he is. What's the could you have the detail of that in your head about his
oh, I'm trying,
um
not perfectly, but there's a dispute about enclosure in Stratford, right? And
yeah,
Shakespeare basically signs a pact with the enclosers that he is
yeah,
not going to interfere with their attempts to enclose the commons.
yeah.
So I'm glad you brought this up, Emma. So yeah, this is again right around the time of As You Like It. So these are issues that are bubbling up, right, creating a lot of tension in his hometown. Um, and he seemed to be kind of fence sitting. In some ways, I think that's very Shakespearean too, right? That
Mm.
he's looking at it more detached. I'm not taking a strong side either way. I'm listening to both sides. I mean, this is the way I like to imagine what was happening during that enclosure controversy, that Shakespeare was trying
Yeah,
to stay um,
yeah,
not burning the bridges or put a foot wrong. He
yeah.
was trying to maintain a kind of
Yes, there's a
neutrality.
cautiousness, isn't there, about Shakespeare, which you could about Shakespeare's views on apparent views or Shakespeare's we can't really get to his views, can we? But Shakespeare's conduct or Shakespeare, the way Shakespeare sets out issues, there's a caution there, which is either sort of large-minded and expansive and able to see, to sort of stand above the fray and see both sides,
Mm.
or is a bit cowardly and sort of uncommitted. And I sometimes find it hard to know what I am arguing about that that sort of that detachment. I wanted us to talk about this just because I think that is one of the really key things that you have. This has obviously been a key part of recent scholarship, and I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about your the work you have done before coming to As You Like It, so people can see sort of what you're bringing to this play at this particular moment. And I should say, um, one of the great there's clearly too much work on Shakespeare and too much focus on Shakespeare to the exclusion of other writers. I don't think anybody would sort of particularly want to argue against that. But there are many advantages to this focus, and one of the particular advantages to the sense that a Shakespeare edition, Shakespeare is always being re-edited and always being represented for readers in different kinds of formats. And in a way that gave me, and I think gave our team, a feeling of liberation, that we are not writing about the play, our individual texts, um, in ways that are going to last forever,
Mm.
or with a sort of magisterial sense of timelessness, but with actually quite a particular sense. What would we want to say now about this
Mm.
play? Maybe these editions have a shelf life of 15 or 20 years or something. Fantastic. What would we want to say right now? Um, and what I wanted to get from Todd was what he has been saying about this period historically, and about the literary texts more in more formal terms about what they are doing in the kind of eco-critical space. So could you say a bit about that work, Todd?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, Emma. Yeah, so when I was working on my PhD, I just remember sort of arguing with the advisors that there needs to be more understanding of the prehistory of the environmental mentality. Uh, Often it's assumed that prior to the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, that humans just considered themselves the end all and be all of creation, and they were entitled to all the fruits of the earth, and they had dominion over the beasts and the birds and the fishes. But in fact, I was had a hunch that maybe it was a little bit more complicated than that. Maybe people did have some compunction and doubt or guilt about the limits of how humans can reap everything from the earth and the resources all for themselves, and if they get entitled to such a big slice of the pie. And maybe people did have these questions about the rights or twinges or pangs of doubt about how we should treat the earth, and whether we could abuse it and just gobble it up all for ourselves. So that was really where this research came from. I mean, I suppose it's what I've done is just combine the two things I love best in the world, which is Shakespeare and nature. But it seemed really urgent that we start to think about this in more detail, that the environmental movement doesn't just flicker on, right? When Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring, she doesn't just throw a switch and suddenly there are environmentalists. There's a long tradition of thinking about humanity's niche in the cosmos, and sort of raising questions about humanity's prerogative over other creatures. So that was the origin of the research, and I wrote a dissertation really focusing primarily on the pastoral tradition. And As You Like It's a big part of that in chapter 5. I look at the play's view of the Forest of Arden as a kind of republic. And remember, it's interesting that Shakespeare writes this play right after Julius Caesar. So there's this, are you right after or are you right before, right? The chronology is a little fuzzy. And Shakespeare's thinking about the downfall of the republic as we move into an empire. And I think that pattern actually is lurking in the background of As You Like It too. That there's this idea of nature as this fallen republic. And when the Duke and his men move out into Arden, they're kind of returning to this pastoral republic of all creatures, kind of parliaments, of nature. So that book really, I mean, it was such a pleasure to write my dissertation. I just felt so energized writing it. It felt like really important work. I got a good response from readers, and I continued to kind of gather material to better understand, to enable other scholars to work more on environmental attitudes in the early modern period. So I've edited an anthology that has over 200 texts in it from 1500 to 1700. And deliberately, Shakespeare is not a major player in it. Again, as you said, he does soak up so much of the limelight that I wanted to shift attention to other writers just to understand the complex, diverse attitudes towards nature across a wider spectrum, not just London and Warwickshire, but from Cornwall to Scotland to Wales, and across lines of gender, class, as well. So that's book was took me 5 years to edit, and at one point it was over 500,000 words, and I had to really prune it down because there's so much material out there. So there's so much more work to be done to better understand the attitudes of and the material practices of ordinary people with the environment in the early modern period. So it's been a joy to work on, and so many scholars have understood the significance of this work, and there's a lot of great research coming out, and has been coming out over the past few years in this field.
And it's such a great example, I think, of how the questions and the things we see in Shakespeare change because of what we are able to see in our own world. And it's not necessarily that Shakespeare was there already or was there before us, but that these have been great texts to think with, haven't they, across a long intellectual history. And it's really working on this series it's been such a pleasure to see people doing that sort of in the moment right now. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to have a go at screen sharing, which is of course perfectly easy, but then always seems to go wrong at moments of high stress. Because I wanted these webinars to inaugurate. I should say to those people who are here with us, if you've got feedback on how we've done this, ping me an email. You can find me at Oxford easily, Emma Smith. If you just Google me at the English faculty in Oxford, ping me an email if you've got suggestions about how we can do this, because we are planning this as a long project to go through the entire canon, as I explained. But one of the things I wanted to get our introducers to do in each webinar was just to talk for a few minutes in a little bit more detail about a particular passage, a particular piece of Shakespearean poetry, or a particular bit of verse, or a particular moment, so that we get a bit of detail into the conversation as well as these larger themes. So I asked Todd what he wanted. This isn't a test. I asked Todd what he would want to, where he might want to do that, and I'm just going to save that. I'm just going to share that now. I hope I am at least. Let's just do that from start. Can you see that, Todd?
Yeah, that's showing up, Emma. Thanks.
Let's hope that everybody else can, but let's just go on. We're at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 1 of As You Like It. If you can't see it, we're just going to proceed as if you can. Just this is the stage direction that you had about like the Forester, so it picks up from what you were talking about. But why don't you just bring out anything that you would like to notice here?
Great, thanks for that invite there, Emma. There's so much to say about this passage. It's hard to know where to begin. But I think with the first line, we can easily forget today how shocking it is for a duke to refer to other people as brothers and co-mates. So there's a profound leveling that occurs once we leave the court and go into the environment, into the natural world. There's a sense that the hierarchies have been completely flattened once we enter the world of Arden. So this is a really significant speech in the play, because this is where we pivot from the corrupt world of the court with all of the treachery and to this place of primeval innocence and goodness, as the Duke says. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a pastoral, perpetual spring, right? It's a vicious, bitterly cold winter. And that the penalty of Adam line there is quite interesting. That line 5, he says, "Here feel we not the penalty of Adam, the season's difference." This is quite curious because the lines that follow make it abundantly clear they do feel the cold. So some editors going back to Tybalt have adopted this emendation of not there to but. Here feel we but the penalty of Adam. So there's a crux in the play. Is the Duke saying that they actually feel the winter, or is he saying that their stoic resolve somehow insulates them against the cold? And he's also celebrating this return to nature and this sense of the moral, intellectual, spiritual fortitude, exhilaration that you get when you abandon luxuries and comforts and rough it in the wild. And I think that is a really evergreen impulse that still so many of us feel in industrial civilization today so keenly. So I think the speech still really resonates. Parts of it, I think Shakespeare's actually thinking back to Aeneas's speech in Book 1 of the Aeneid, when he's trying to rally his men after they've been shipwrecked on the coast of Carthage, and saying, someday we'll look back on this and remember this, and fondly, right? Well, we'll remember these hard times, and we'll feel tough, and we'll feel like we've been tested, and we'll have passed the test. And I think the Duke is trying to say the same thing. It's a pep talk, really, to the men who have given up their cushy life to go rough it in the winter woods with him. But the final lines of the speech are really quite famous. And there's the conspicuous alliteration throughout the speech that marks it as extremely poetic. So that it's a very pastoral, poeticized view of the natural world. That's also anthropomorphized, right? That there are tongues in trees, for instance. But the speech is, like the clown, a kind of touchstone for the play and a touchstone for the pastoral tradition, I think. The Sermons and Stones line, for instance, was quoted frequently by John Muir, the great American environmentalist, and he used it in some of his writings that were manifestos that led to the founding of the national park system in America. So it's interesting to kind of trace the correlations or the genealogy between Shakespeare's Duke Senior and kind of the 20th century environmental movement. And Shakespeare's words are really echoing in the early environmental movement, and that's really quite jaw-dropping.
One thing that's amazing. I did not know that. That's a wonderful wonderful detail, and not just a detail actually. It resonates really widely. One of the things one of the problems I have, I think, with As You Like It. One of the problems, I'm sure I shouldn't really admit this because who cares about my problems, and especially not with As You Like It, but I've started, so I'll carry on, is I think there are too many speeches in it. Now, is that may seem a silly thing to say, of course, a play is made of speeches, but what I mean is this is a play in which lots of characters are sort of, they're not really talking, are they? They're kind of delivering speeches. Do you think that comes from the pastoral world where pastoral figures are often giving speeches or in singing competitions or something? There's not a lot of just chat, is there? There's quite a lot of formal formal interaction in one way or another. But one of my experiences of this play, and maybe people on this in the webinar have it also, is of a play, perhaps again, your comparison with Hamlet is really just ringing in my head still. Maybe a bit like Hamlet, where a lot of the events are verbal events rather than anything else.
Yeah, that's a great way to capture the spirit of the play. There is a lot of conversation. There's a lot of debate that goes back to the pastoral tradition where you have the two shepherds whether it's a singing competition or an intellectual debate. And that Shakespeare picks up on that from writers like Edmund Spenser. But there are also these great set speeches. Jaques' All the World's a Stage being the most iconic one from the play. But this one is also really important. I think, it's part of it's really here what's happening is Shakespeare has to scene paint, right? He's on a bare minimalist stage and we have to feel transported into a green wood. So that's part of the reason for the length of this 20 some line speech. But it's also the Duke has the authority here too, doesn't he? So he's the leader of this band of merry men out in the woods. He's the Robin Hood figure. So he's the one who's has the mic, as it were. But it's important that the First Lord does butt in to correct the Duke about Jaques' point of view, is critique of this pastoral fantasy. He punctures it a bit, doesn't he? Saying, right, you do more usurp than your brother that has banished you.
Yeah.
Because you're going off to kill the deer and they were here first. And aren't you doing to them what your brother did to you and ousting them from their assigned and native dwelling place? He actually says, kill them up, which is a peculiar expression, which sounds like what we would say extirpate, right? To eradicate the deer from the forest, which is something that's again happening in Shakespeare's day. So that's another moment where the play is referring to environmental issues in Shakespeare's time that make it seem very far-sighted, very prescient for our own.
There's loads more we could say about that. We've got one more slide that I wanted to show just to give a bit of a sense about the editorial questions. I mean, you mentioned here that here feel we not, or but the long history that we're all part of when we work in Shakespeare studies of thinking about and often emending the play. And I wanted just to sort of draw the curtain a bit on this particular thing, because we argued about it, didn't we, Todd, about a particular aspect of the play, a particular textual moment, a crux or a reading. And I thought I would give you a chance maybe to speak to that. As it happens, I absolutely agree with you, although we had made the decision that these plays, these texts for the Oxford World's Classics would follow the text of the New Oxford Shakespeare. But I'm just going to put it up in a way which I hope is reasonably visible. What we've got um, here on the left is the first folio text of 1623, so the only early witness to As You Like It, and then we've got a page with a tiny, tiny bit of my finger of Todd's As You Like It in the in New Oxford in the old World's Classics. So Todd, do you just want to talk about this for a minute? I've got another version of this. Would this help you?
Great. Thank you, Emma. Yeah, this is a wonderful moment in the play. It's a great example of how returning to early modern texts can generate new layers of meaning and ambiguity in the text. And I do want to say that, I think in hindsight, sticking with the New Oxford text here was the right call. So I'm very happy with the way the edition has handled this particular textual crux. As you can see in the bits that Emma circled in the red, the folio reads, his hand with his. So this is the denouement in which Rosalind is returning on stage as Rosalind for the wedding. And the text in this song says that we have a marriage in which the couples join hand. The hand fastening was kind of the highlight of an Elizabethan marriage, right? And here it's going to be two men's hands, right? His hand with his that are being joined. And so there was a piece written by Jeffrey Maston years ago arguing that really drew attention to this, that this maybe isn't a slip up on the part of the compositor. Maybe this was an editorial, and maybe this was actually an authorial a rendering of the line. And even if we don't buy that, that does seem a bit of a stretch that Shakespeare would have the daughter and then call it the daughter a his, use his pronoun for the daughter. If we rely on some of the textual theory of people like Jerome, again, this idea of the social text, that the errors, the errata in the text are actually part of the meaning of the text. They're not something that we need to erase and eliminate and hide them away. If we embrace that, we can see that the slips matter, right? In a kind of Freudian sense, even the errors, the glitches in the text reveal things about the text. And here, I think this is such a perfect error. If it's a compositor error, it's a kind of heaven sent mistake, because it speaks directly to the gender confusion in the play. We haven't had a whole lot of time to dig into that today, Emma, which is a shame. But those of you who know the play know that it is a phenomenal tour de force deconstruction of gender norms and gender identity. And it's so wonderful that in the final speeches of the play, we have this confusion where it's not clear who's actually getting married here. Is this a heterosexual marriage, or is this a homosexual union? So I love the confusion that Hyman claims he's here to clear up, right? I peace ho, I bar confusion. But in fact, there's more confusion. The confusion, the gender bending in the play doesn't really end.
Yeah, and you can see, I mean, the texts, modern texts, I mean, like ours, like the one we've spent time on and we're committed to, make compromises, I think, in order to be more readable, more accessible to readers, and particularly perhaps sometimes to help readers sort of visualize what's happening on stage. But I'm looking here at the stage direction we've also got here in our edition. Just above Hyman's speech, enter Hyman with Rosalind and Celia, and then that square bracket as themselves. And if you just look over to the first folio, we've just got Hyman, Rosalind, and Celia. We don't know if they are as themselves. And when you start to think about it, Lord knows what that means in any, in what way is anybody ever like themselves? But yeah, it's a wonderful queer ending, queer potential, and I'm really, really pleased you brought that out. I'm going to stop sharing that now because we've just got one last thing that I want us to do, Todd, while I'm encouraging people to get their questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry about if you've got your hand raised, it would be better for us, not least because of the recording, if you could put your question in the Q&A. So do that while I'm just asking Todd one last thing. So if people, as I'm sure they have been, are inspired to think more about As You Like It, clearly we want to encourage them to look at the play and our Oxford World's Classics edition with your introduction is a great way to do that. But other As You Like It's are also available. What else would you recommend for someone who wants to take a next step in exploring this play?
Oof. One thing you might do is go read Thomas Lodge's Rosalind. First off, it's always an enlightening experience to see Shakespeare's sources and how he handled them. Uh, I had kind of read it quickly in graduate school, but to write the introduction, I went back and read it carefully, and it's crazy that he uses the word content 61 times in Rosalind, and Shakespeare seems to have picked up on that and uses the word content repeatedly in all these different permutations. So just seeing how Shakespeare has altered his source, how he plays with his sources and picks up on these verbal tics in the sources is really enlightening. There's a great book called As If that I also recommend by what's his name? I'm blanking on the name of the author who wrote that. It's a fantastic introduction, As If, which is kind of asks a series of questions about the play, and then provides these really pithy and insightful answers to them. So that's, I think, a very accessible introduction to the play. Just reading a little bit more on the pastoral tradition, I think that's helpful if you've not encountered pastoral literature before. Just getting a sense of texts like Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar, Sidney's Arcadia, which are kind of part of the intellectual DNA of the Elizabethans. Or just you go see a production, really. That's always the best thing. Go to the Playhouse and see a version of it, because that's really what these plays were written for, yeah. Right? For a live performance.
Fantastic. It's William West's book, isn't it? As If, William West. Perfect. That's absolutely great. What we're going to do to round up is take some of the questions that people have put in the chat. One question was whether this is being recorded. It is being recorded, and these will be available on the Faculty of English at the University of Oxford's YouTube channel. So if you follow the Faculty of English at Oxford on social media, you should be able to trace that. There's an interesting question about class and nature, which I'm going to read out. What role does class and nature play in As You Like It, do you think? In this play, we see theoretically all classes interacted with each other. There's the idea you mentioned of humans having an idea of dominion over the earth, but where are the lines in class? Who has dominion over what and why? Which I suppose speaks a little bit to the Duke and the co-mates, as well as Corin as a working shepherd and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic question. Whoever posed that. Yeah, that makes me think immediately of the dialogue between Touchstone and Corin, isn't it? Where they Touchstone, it seems, go back and forth about how much he loves being in the country and yet how tedious and dull it is. And Corin's views really clear. We're getting the earthy boots on the ground perspective from an actual shepherd. So that's one of the achievements of the play. Again, you don't see as much of that in Lodge, right? We don't have that voice of the actual working rural poor. And Shakespeare, admittedly, it's sporadic, but it is in there in the play. And Corin tells us that he doesn't own the sheep that he grazes, right? I'm shepherd to another man. He tells us, so Shakespeare is reflecting on the economics of sheep farming in the early modern period. And yeah, as Raymond Williams established in his great book, Country in the City, the pastorals often tended to occlude the working class perspective in its idealization of the countryside, and they eliminate labor. And that's actually, a gross misrepresentation. So Shakespeare tries to address it. He doesn't thoroughly succeed, but there is at least an acknowledgement of it. And I think that's part of the work's intellectual integrity. So thanks for that question. It's a great point.
Right. And there's a question about Rosalind taking on both male and female qualities. And I'm conscious, Todd, as you pointed out, that that aspect of the play we've not really talked so much about. So let's take some questions about that. Would you see Rosalind as taking on a morphing or representation of both male and female qualities, a little bit like Virginia Woolf's idea of the androgynous mind, wasn't it? And with that, does there seem to be a criticism of these qualities in both Rosalind and Orlando?
Yeah, and let's not forget the name of that novel by Virginia Woolf, with the androgynous protagonist Orlando. So I think that's, I
Yes,
think like
or at least this, there's a possibility of changing
yeah.
sex, isn't there, in Orlando? I guess Orlando is also beautiful in an androgynous way. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that is central to the play, and I think the way that the question's been phrased, it chimes with how I see it. That just as Rosalind is able to mock love and to indulge in it, he is able to straddle these gender divides to absorb both of them. And yeah, there's ridiculing of chauvinistic stereotypes about women as promiscuous and fickle and giddy, and I think that Shakespeare does that to, in some ways, expose those or exercise those as stereotypes. Rosalind, again, as you said earlier, is so much sharper than Orlando, so much more mature in her understanding of the intricacies of the human heart and of human relationships. That it's clear she is more than Orlando's intellectual equal. She outclasses him. Because partially this is a result of the conventions of the Elizabethan stage with transvestite drama, that we have a boy actor playing Rosalind who then impersonates Ganymede, who then masquerades as Rosalind. That it really is head spinning what Shakespeare's done here. Out just with the layering of the gender is much more sophisticated than anything else that's been attempted on the early modern stage. So we see just how performative gender is in this play, and I think, as you like, it seems to anticipate some of Judith Butler's theories on gender identity and gender performativity of 400 years of Aunt Lalettes. So it's a really stunning achievement.
That the use of the adoption of the name Ganymede is also interesting, isn't it? I mean, Ganymede is a figuration of queer or same-sex desire. It's obviously also related to status and unequal status as well. So it speaks to that. But there's a queerer play which is not just about gender identity, but perhaps about sexuality, sexualities more generally. Yeah, I'm thinking about. I'm still thinking about the question about class and status, which is really interesting. One of the she's a much loved character, isn't she, Rosalind? But one of the things it's hard to forgive her for is when she says to Phoebe, who is in love with the Ganymede figure, she more or less says to Phoebe, actually, the problem isn't that I'm not actually a man. The problem is that I am so far your superior, sweetie, that you're completely barking up the wrong tree. And she says, "Go on, marry your own the suitor from your own class. You are not for all markets. You are not for all markets." It's kind of exquisitely cruel, but it sort of reinstates the sense that you can play around with lots of things in Shakespeare's comedies, gender, sexuality. You can't tend to play around all that much with status, can you?
Yeah.
If you're the daughter of the Duke, you're going to marry the son of the nobleman, all that.
Yeah, that's a really strange moment, isn't it? And it's really quite biting. She insults Phoebe because of the hardness of her hands that she's working. As a working woman or as a dairy woman, that her hands are chapped and hard. And one of the things that we don't often think about is the hand as a kind of erotic object, right? You don't see a lot of fixation on the hand today. This sort of romanticizing or eroticizing of the hand, but it seems like Shakespeare's culture did
Mm.
aestheticize the hand. And so because she's a working woman and her hands are hard, um, Rosalind says, I thought her gloves were on, right? But it was her hand.
Yeah.
Uh, so you're
She's a
absolutely
cow,
right.
isn't she, really? I know that's not a technical
Yeah,
term, not a very literary term, but that's she's a bit of a cow at that point.
yeah. I think that's, yeah, well said. And fair point.
But
Yeah.
I'm always struck by, that um, the way that the things that Shakespeare can play with, or Shakespeare's worlds can imagine differently. And I suppose your point about the Duke's co-mates is a model of a sort of equality, the Robin Hood kind of equality in the forest. But elsewhere, that hierarchies are actually they're not erased in Arden, are they? They're actually reinstated through forms of labor and ownership, wealth and possession and so on in some interesting ways. It's yeah. The more I think about our discussion this evening, the more I think that sort of both and kind of structure of the play is quite useful. That it both idealizes the possibilities of art and also reveals that it can't quite do it can't be that it can't be that.
We want to coexist in harmony with nature, but we still have to eat, right?
Okay, okay,
We have to
we
go
do
kill.
still have to eat. I'm going to just take a couple more questions. One is about the title of the play. So you mentioned that you thought the title should be Rosalind, like Lodge's prose source. And it's a nice question here. Should the new title be read as you like it or as you like it? Or I suppose we could say as you like it, or
Oh, that's a great question. Where do you place the stress there? Uh, Robert Watson has a wonderful reading of the title as the play about like, as about metaphor, as about simile, and comparing this to that and how humans relate to the natural world. So the like, I think, is maybe the most important part of the play for me. I'm really persuaded by a lot of what Watson writes in his essay in his book Back to Nature. But yeah, there's different ways of reading that. Bernard Shaw thought it was Shakespeare sort of pandering to the audience. And this is as you like it. I'm doing what you want, writing a crowd pleaser.
mm,
Um, Juliet Duesenberg, I think, argues that it's an allusion to Chaucer's Wife of Bath, and where the knight has to say to the woman, "As you like it, so it pleases me." Right. So about the mastery of women, granting more authority and power to women, which is also, I think, an intriguing reading of it. So yeah, there are lots of different ways to interpret it, and again, I don't think there's a definitive, thorough, impregnable answer here. Um, it's as we like it.
I'm going to take two more questions, one shorter and one longer. Tina asks, could the melancholic Jaques only exist in this pastoral setting? Could Jaques exist in London? I love
Mm.
that. I love the way you've refined that question, Tina. I mean, because it also gets us to a sense, are these uh, is it a spoiler to say what happens to Jaques at the end?
Mm.
I mean,
Oh,
he's staying there, isn't he, rather than going back. Mm.
yeah. That's a really, well, novel way of thinking about the character as someone who's really created by that sylvan environment, by the exile as part of what defines him. Um, could he exist in London? Well, I mean, he is a progenitor of Hamlet, right? So I think there are a lot of malcontents and melancholics on the early modern stage. So there certainly is possible, but it as his decision to stay there does seem to suggest that he's found a home there, that he's more comfortable in the natural world than he is in the overcrowded and corrupt court.
Mm.
So um,
Mm.
yeah, his melancholy is both indulged and soothed, I think, in the natural world, and the play makes that clear. And his refusal to join in the dance is, yeah, symptomatic of that.
So I'm just going to, I'm just looking through some of our other questions. We've answered that one. Um, and just check. We've covered quite a lot of the questions that people are asking. Interesting final question here is, do you agree that this is a play primarily about ownership, which is an interesting take? Question about views on the androgynous aspect of Rosalind represented in modern theatre. So I'm just putting these out so that people can hear them in the conversation, even if we don't get time to get to them. Um, Regarding questions of gender, individuality, and performativity, how does all the world's a stage and men and women merely players fit into such terms? Which is interesting. A reminder of what this play owes to John Lilly's gender sort of reinvention comedy Galatea. Which I think is a great question. Galatea and Lily's plays are having a moment really right now. But maybe we'll finish with this. I think this is somebody asking for a friend. If you were directing a 45-minute cut of this play for years 6 to 8, so I guess that is 11 to 13-year-olds ish. Is that right? How would you sell it to the student actors so that they get excited about the play? So,
Ooh.
what do you think about this as a play for young people?
In one word, panto. The
Okay.
great English tradition. I think it is a very musical play. And it's got a clown, and there's a lot of bantering to the audience. Touchstone saying, "You let the forest judge." So, because I think the English panto tradition is so great. I've seen kind of Punch and Judy, Taming of the Shrews. Why not do a kind of panto as you like it?
Fantastic. That's a fantastic place to finish. We're going to wrap up now. Thanks for being with us for the first of these webinars. The first Monday in February, um, I am going to be talking about Macbeth. It was clearly the perk of being the general editor that I could choose my own play, so I chose Macbeth. But don't worry, I won't be interviewing myself, even I am not quite as um, solipsistic as that. So in the next second of our webinars, the first Monday in February, I'll be talking to the Royal Shakespeare Company Artistic Director Emeritus, Greg Doran, about my introduction to Macbeth and about the play more generally, his experience of putting it on in the theatre. So do join us then. And thanks very much for being here today. Thanks a lot.